April 17, 1943. 2:47 a.m. North Atlantic, 340 miles southwest of Iceland. Lieutenant Commander Howard Sands grips the rail of HMS Sunflower as the corvette pitches violently in 18-foot swells. Below him, somewhere in the black water, Captain Lieutenant Werner Hartmann's U-564 is diving deep. Sands has exactly 90 seconds before the German submarine reaches crush depth, too deep for his depth charges to follow. The sonar operator calls out bearing and range. Sands gives the order. 24 projectiles launch simultaneously from the forward deck, their trails invisible in the darkness. 3 seconds, that's all it took. What Hartmann didn't know, what no U-boat commander in the Kriegsmarine knew in April 1943, was that the rules of undersea warfare had just changed forever. Before we continue with Howard Sands' incredible story, we need your help to keep these forgotten heroes alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you a veteran? Did your grandfather serve? Do you have a connection to this war? We want to hear from you. Now back to the North Atlantic, April 1943, where Howard Sands was about to discover whether his new weapon actually worked. Howard Sands grew up in Portsmouth, England, where his father repaired fishing boats. He was 19 years old when he joined the Royal Navy in 1938, lying about a childhood injury that left his left hand with limited grip strength. He told the recruitment officer it was arthritis. It was actually from a dock accident when he was 12. A winch cable had crushed 2 fingers. He'd learned to compensate, to use tools differently than other men. That adaptation would save his life and the lives of hundreds of others. By 1943, Sands was 24 and already a veteran of 17 convoy escort missions. He'd watched 23 merchant ships go down. He'd helped pull 47 survivors from freezing water. He'd seen 31 men die on the decks of his own ship from hypothermia before they could be carried below. But what kept him awake at night wasn't the men they couldn't save from torpedoed ships. It was the U-boats they couldn't destroy. Between January and April 1943, Allied escorts sank only 11 U-boats in the North Atlantic. During that same period, German submarines sent 121 merchant vessels to the bottom, over 680 000 tons of shipping. The mathematics were brutal and simple. The Allies were losing the Battle of the Atlantic. The problem wasn't courage. The problem wasn't determination. The problem was depth charges. Standard Mark VII depth charges weighed 420 pounds and had to be rolled off the stern of the escort vessel or thrown from side-mounted throwers. They sank at roughly 10 feet per second, set to explode at preset depths, usually between 50 and 300 feet. A U-boat commander with good nerves could hear the splashes on his hydrophones, calculate the pattern, and execute an emergency dive or hard turn. If he went deep fast enough, he'd pass below the preset detonation depth before the charges reached him. If he turned hard enough, he'd slip between the falling explosives. Worse, the moment an escort ship launched depth charges, it had to maintain course and speed for at least 3 minutes. During those 3 minutes, the ship was deaf. Its own propeller noise and the concussion of the explosions made sonar useless. The U-boat could turn, dive, surface, or run. The escort was blind. The statistics told the story. In 1942, Allied ships dropped 4,035 depth charges for every U-boat sunk. 4,000 depth charges, 1 submarine. Lieutenant Jeremy Morrison was the first friend Sands lost to this mathematics. Morrison was from Cardiff, 23 years old, engaged to a girl named Helen who worked at a munitions factory. He showed Sands the ring the night before, silver with a small sapphire, saved for over 8 months. They were going to marry on his next leave, open a garage together after the war. Morrison and Sands Auto Repair 50-50 partnership. They shook hands on it while smoking on deck, watching the convoy spread out under a rare clear sky. Morrison died 38 hours later, aboard HMS Bluebell. The corvette caught a U-boat on the surface at dawn, 8 miles from the convoy. The German submarine crash-dived. Bluebell ran in for a depth charge attack. Standard procedure: maintain course, roll charges, wait for explosions. The U-boat commander, they later learned it was Korvettenkapitän Heinrich Schonder in U-123, waited until Bluebell was committed to its attack run, then fired a single torpedo from 400 yards while still submerged at 120 feet. The torpedo hit Bluebell amidships at 6:42 a.m. The corvette broke in half and sank in 17 seconds, 47 men aboard, 4 survivors. Morrison wasn't one of them. Sands heard about it over radio while HMS Sunflower was screening the port side of the convoy. He remembers the exact static pattern of the transmission. He remembers the smell of diesel exhaust mixing with the salt spray. He remembers that his coffee had gone cold in his hand. What Morrison's death taught him, what 17 subsequent missions reinforced, was that depth charges forced escort ships to commit suicide. You had to run straight over the submarine's last known position. You had to go deaf and blind. You had to maintain course while a U-boat commander who could still hear, still maneuver, still fire, decided whether to run or fight. Between February and early April 1943, 11 more escorts went down during depth charge runs. 11 ships, 471 men. All killed by the 3-minute window of blindness that depth charges created. Sands started carrying a small notebook. He recorded every attack he witnessed or heard about over radio. Date, time, number of depth charges dropped, result. The numbers accumulated like an indictment. March 4th, HMS Harvester dropped 16 charges. U-boat escapes, Harvester torpedoed during turn, 145 dead. March 11th, HMS Buttercup drops 24 charges. U-boat escapes, Buttercup torpedoed during reload, 91 dead. March 22nd, HMCS Weyburn drops 18 charges. U-boat escapes, Weyburn torpedoed during pursuit, 71 dead. The pattern was consistent. Drop charges, go blind. On April 3, 1943, HMS Sunflower pulled into Liverpool for refit. The crew was given 72 hours shore leave. Sands didn't go home to Portsmouth. He stayed aboard. That night, alone in the forward equipment locker, at 11:40 p.m., Sands looked at the new weapon that had been installed during refit. His orders said only, Hedgehog anti-submarine spigot mortar, experimental, report results. The device looked like it had been designed by someone who'd never seen a ship before. 24 steel rails arranged in an oval pattern, pointed forward and upward at a fixed 45-degree angle. Each rail held a single projectile, a finned bomb that looked like a small aircraft rocket. The entire launcher was mounted ahead of the bridge, welded to reinforced deck plates. Sands had been to the briefing. He'd heard the technical explanation from a nervous Admiralty engineer who chain-smoked through the entire presentation. The concept was simple. Instead of dropping charges behind the ship, fire projectiles ahead of it. Instead of sinking slowly, the bombs would arc through the air and hit the water 250 yards in front of the escort. Instead of exploding at a preset depth, they would only detonate on contact with a submarine's hull. The engineer had explained it 3 times, as if expecting disbelief. The projectiles are inert unless they strike something solid underwater. They won't explode from the impact with water. They won't explode if they hit the seabed, only if they strike a submarine hull. 24 projectiles. Launched simultaneously, 3 seconds from first to last. Impact pattern covering a circle roughly 100 feet in diameter. Sands understood immediately why this was revolutionary, and why it was also terrifying. Revolutionary because the escort ship never had to pass over the submarine's position. You could fire from 250 yards away and maintain sonar contact the entire time. The U-boat commander wouldn't hear the splashes behind or beside him. He'd hear them ahead of him, where he couldn't be, where he wasn't diving toward. And if just one of the 24 projectiles hit his hull, the 35-pound explosive charge would crack his pressure vessel like an eggshell. Terrifying because every projectile fired forward was fired into the space your own ship was moving toward. If a projectile failed to arc properly, if the wind shear was wrong, if the angle was miscalculated by even a few degrees, your own weapon could land in front of your bow, and if one of those projectiles hit debris, a whale, a reef, anything solid while your ship was 200 yards away. The engineer had been very clear about that part. The blast radius of a premature detonation is approximately 150 yards. Stay at least 250 yards from impact point. Maintain that distance. Sands ran the calculations in his head. If you fired at a U-boat at 400 yards range, the projectiles would land 250 yards ahead of you, 150 yards from the target. If the target dove and moved forward at 8 knots, it would be at projectile impact point in roughly 11 seconds. If your ship maintained 15 knots, you'd be at projectile impact point in 38 seconds. 38 seconds to know if you'd hit the submarine or killed yourself. The standing orders were explicit. Hedgehog mortar to be used only when depth charge is unavailable or ineffective. Maintain minimum 400-yard range from target. Do not fire if range decreasing. Sands stood in that equipment locker for 40 minutes, studying the launcher in the dim light of a single bulb. He touched each rail, checked each projectile's securing pin, examined the firing mechanism. The device was crude but solid, British engineering at its most functional. It would either work perfectly or fail spectacularly with nothing in between. What Sands noticed, what he wrote in his notebook at 12:17 a.m., was that the rails were adjustable, not easily, and not according to any official documentation. But someone at the factory had left the mounting brackets slightly loose. You could shift the entire oval pattern up or down by about 4 degrees. You could widen or narrow the spread pattern by adjusting the outer rails. The engineer hadn't mentioned this. The technical manual didn't document it. But Sands had spent his childhood watching his father adjust the tension on fishing winches, compensate for warped deck timbers, make old equipment work when the specifications said it shouldn't. He spent the next 6 hours, all night until dawn, experimenting with pencil and paper. If you lowered the elevation by 3 degrees, the projectiles would land at 215 yards instead of 250. If you tightened the spread pattern, the impact circle would shrink from 100 feet to roughly 75. A tighter pattern meant better chance of a hit. Shorter range meant less time for the submarine to evade. It also meant firing your own explosives 185 yards from your bow, well inside the safe distance. On April 8th, HMS Sunflower departed Liverpool as part of Escort Group B7, protecting convoy HX-233, 42 merchant ships carrying fuel oil, steel and ammunition from Halifax to Liverpool. Sands was assistant weapons officer. The Hedgehog launcher was his responsibility. For 9 days, the convoy crawled east across the North Atlantic at 7 knots. No contacts, no attacks. On April 16th, that changed. The Wolfpack found them at 8:30 p.m., 3 U-boats coordinating attack positions ahead of the convoy. HMS Sunflower was on the port flank when sonar picked up the first submarine, bearing 287, range 900 yards, depth approximately 80 feet. Commander Richard Mills ordered hard to port flank speed. The corvette turned into the contact, accelerating to 18 knots. Standard attack procedure. Close to 400 yards, fire depth charges, pray. Sands was on deck when Mills gave the order. Prepare depth charges for launch. He looked forward at the Hedgehog launcher. 24 projectiles ready, untested. Unauthorized modifications completed 3 nights earlier, while the rest of the crew slept. Sands had adjusted the elevation down by 3 degrees and tightened the spread pattern by rotating the outer rails inward 2 inches each. His calculations said the projectiles would now land in a 70-foot circle at 215 yards. His calculations also said he'd be court-martialed if anyone discovered the modifications. Mills was on the bridge, watching the range decrease. 700 yards, 600 yards. The plan was to fire depth charges at 300 yards, then pass over the submarine and hope the charges found it on the way down. Sands made a decision that violated 3 direct orders and could have ended his naval career. He called up to the bridge. "Sir, request permission to fire Hedgehog mortar. We have clean solution, good range." Mills hesitated for exactly 4 seconds. Then, "Permission granted. Fire when ready." Range 440 yards. Sands positioned himself at the Hedgehog firing station, a simple electrical switch mounted on a steel box. His left hand, the damaged one, the one with the limited grip, rested on the switch. His right hand braced against the rail. The U-boat was diving. Sonar called out, "Target descending, estimated depth 100 feet, rate of descent 2 feet per second. Range 380 yards. Sands' mouth was dry. He could smell the aviation grease they used on the launcher rails. He could feel the deck vibrating from the Corvette's engines at full power. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, louder than the wind. Range 340 yards. The mathematics were simple. Fire too early, the projectiles would land where the submarine used to be. Fire too late, your ship would enter the blast radius before the projectiles detonated. The window was approximately 8 seconds wide. Range 310 yards. Sands flipped the safety cover off the firing switch. His thumb rested on the button. The metal was cold. Range 290 yards. Sonar. Target depth 120 feet, bearing steady. Range 270 yards. Sands pressed the switch. The Hedgehog launcher fired with a sound like canvas ripping. A rapid succession of pneumatic thumps as each projectile left its rail. The entire sequence took 27 seconds. 24 finned bombs arced upward and forward, leaving thin vapor trails in the cold air. They reached apogee at about 70 feet, then dove toward the black water ahead of HMS Sunflower. They hit the water in a tight pattern 218 yards ahead of the Corvette's bow. From the deck, it looked like a circular cluster of small geysers, 24 white plumes rising simultaneously, then collapsing, then nothing. The projectiles sank. The North Atlantic swallowed them. HMS Sunflower continued forward at 18 knots, closing on the impact point at roughly 600 yards per minute. 15 seconds, no explosion. 20 seconds, nothing. Sands felt his stomach turn. The projectiles had missed. The U-boat had evaded. He'd violated orders, modified experimental equipment without authorization, and achieved exactly nothing. Court-martial was certain. 24 seconds. Then the ocean erupted. The detonation occurred 140 feet below the surface, 195 yards ahead of HMS Sunflower. It wasn't the rolling thunder of a depth charge. It was sharper, more concentrated. A single massive concussion that sent a column of white water 50 feet into the air, mixed with black oil and debris. The sonar operator's voice over the intercom. Contact lost. Massive cavitation at target bearing. Break-up noises. She's hit, sir. She's breaking up. Within 30 seconds, the proof came to the surface. Wooden planks, pieces of clothing, a life jacket with German lettering, an oil slick spreading in the moonlight. At 2:51 a.m., a larger piece of debris surfaced, a section of pressure hull about 6 feet square, twisted metal with rivets torn out. U-564 had taken 312 men down over her operational career. Captain Lieutenant Werner Hartmann had survived 17 missions. He'd sunk 23 Allied ships totaling 89, 0 tons. He'd evaded over 40 depth charge attacks. The Hedgehog had destroyed his submarine, with the first salvo ever fired in combat. Commander Mills came down from the bridge at 3:10 a.m. He found Sands still standing at the launcher, staring at the oil slick now 400 yards astern. Mills didn't congratulate him. He didn't shake his hand. He looked at the Hedgehog launcher for a long moment, then at Sands, then back at the launcher. "That wasn't 250 yards, Mills said. "No, sir." "You modified it." "Yes, sir." "Without authorization." "Yes, sir." Mills was quiet for another moment. Then, "How many projectiles hit?" "One, sir. That's all it takes." Mills nodded slowly. "Write a full report, include your modifications. I want specifications, angles, everything." He started back toward the bridge, then stopped. "And Sands." "Sir, next time we make contact, you're firing that thing again." Over the next 6 days, convoy HX-233 encountered 4 more U-boats. HMS Sunflower fired the Hedgehog mortar 3 times. 2 confirmed destructions, 1 probable damage, forcing the submarine to surface and scuttle. By April 24th, when the convoy reached Liverpool, Sands had spent every off-duty hour teaching other crew members how to operate the modified launcher. He'd written 17 pages of technical notes. He'd calculated firing solutions for different ranges, different depths, different sea conditions. He'd also received a priority radio message from the Admiralty. Report to Fleet Anti-Submarine Warfare Division immediately upon arrival. Bring all documentation regarding Hedgehog modifications. Sands reported as ordered on April 25th at 9:00 a.m. He expected arrest. He expected court-martial for unauthorized modification of experimental military equipment. Instead, he found himself in a room with 12 other officers, 3 civilian engineers, and a Royal Navy Commodore who introduced himself as Harold Mack, Director of Anti-Submarine Weapons Development. Mack got straight to business. Lieutenant Commander Sands, you violated approximately 9 regulations when you modified that launcher. You also achieved the first 3 confirmed Hedgehog destructions in combat. We need to understand exactly what you did, and we need to know if it can be replicated. The meeting lasted 7 hours. Sands explained every modification, every calculation, every adjustment. The engineers took notes. They asked about the rail angles, the spread pattern, the firing sequence timing. They wanted to know about sea conditions, target depth, range calculations. One engineer, a thin man from Sheffield named Peter Worth, kept circling back to the same question. But weren't you terrified of a premature detonation? You were firing well inside the safe radius. Sands thought about Morrison, about the 47 men who died on HMS Bluebell because standard depth charge procedure required running blind over a submarine, about the 471 men dead in 3 months from attacks during the mandatory 3-minute deafness. No, Sands said. I was more terrified of missing. Worth stared at him for a moment, then wrote something in his notebook. The Admiralty's decision came through on April 29th. All Hedgehog launchers would be modified to Sands' specifications. The firing range would be reduced from 250 to 215 yards. The spread pattern would be tightened. The adjustment procedures would be documented and distributed to all escort vessels equipped with the weapon. Sands would not be court-martialed. He would be reassigned to the Anti-Submarine Warfare Division to oversee implementation and training. He would also receive no public recognition, no promotion, no official commendation. The Admiralty's reasoning was explicit in the internal memo. Public acknowledgement of unauthorized modifications to experimental weapons would undermine discipline and encourage similar violations. What the Admiralty did do, quietly, without announcement, was ship modified Hedgehog launchers to 127 escort vessels between May and August 1943. The results were immediate and devastating for the U-boat force. In May 1943, Allied escorts sank 43 German submarines, the highest monthly total of the war to that point. Hedgehog-equipped ships accounted for 17 of those destructions. In June, the number rose to 29 Hedgehog destructions. By September, U-boat command had issued standing orders. If enemy vessel approaches from ahead and no depth charges are dropped, assume Hedgehog mortar and execute emergency evasive maneuvers immediately. But emergency evasive maneuvers don't help when 24 projectiles are already in the air, descending toward a 70-foot circle directly ahead of your boat. From a German submarine commander's perspective, the Hedgehog was a nightmare precisely because it violated their tactical understanding of anti-submarine warfare. For 3 years, U-boat captains had learned to listen for the splash of depth charges behind or beside them, then execute turns and emergency dives during the escort's 3-minute blind period. That was the game. That was survivable. The Hedgehog changed the game fundamentally. The projectiles landed ahead of the submarine, in the direction it was moving, in the space it was diving into. The escort ship maintained sonar contact throughout. There was no blind period, no 3 minutes of freedom. The U-boat commander could hear the enemy the entire time, knew the enemy could hear him, knew projectiles were falling toward his exact position. Worse, the projectiles only exploded on contact. A U-boat commander couldn't count the explosions to know when the attack was over. If he heard nothing, it meant either all 24 projectiles had missed, or they were still sinking toward him, inert, waiting to strike his hull. Captain Lieutenant Peter Kremer, commander of U-333, described the experience in his war diary after a Hedgehog attack on June 18, 1943. We heard the projectiles enter the water ahead of us, a rapid series of distinct impacts different from depth charge splashes. I ordered emergency dive and hard to starboard. For 47 seconds we heard nothing. Then two distinct metallic strikes against the hull, one forward, one amidships. Neither exploded. We were apparently struck by dud projectiles. Two others may have hit, we cannot be certain. We maintained silent running for 4 hours. I do not know why we survived. U-333 survived because two of the Hedgehog projectiles that struck its hull had manufacturing defects in their contact detonators. The submarine limped back to Lorient with two dents in its pressure hull, each surrounded by flaked paint and stress cracks. The boat was declared unfit for further service. Kremer was reassigned to a training division. Out of the 24 projectiles fired at U-333, 2 had hit. 2 others had come within 10 feet. The remaining 20 had missed. A 50% near-miss rate, an 8% direct hit rate, and complete destruction of the submarine's operational capability. From spring 1943 through the end of the war, Hedgehog-equipped ships fired approximately 400 salvos, about 129, 600 individual projectiles. German records and post-war analysis credit the weapon with 268 confirmed U-boat destructions and an additional 47 submarines damaged severely enough to be withdrawn from service. The destruction rate was remarkable. 1 U-boat destroyed for every 21 salvos fired. Compared to depth charges, which required an average of 67 attacks per destruction in 1942, the Hedgehog was 3 times more effective. But the real value wasn't in the destructions, it was in the deterrence. By late 1943, U-boat commanders knew that attacking a convoy meant facing Hedgehog-equipped escorts. The Wolfpack tactics that had been so effective in 1942, multiple submarines coordinating surface attacks at night, became suicidal. If you surfaced to attack, you could be spotted. If you dove to evade, you entered the Hedgehog's killing zone. The 3-minute window of opportunity after an escort launched depth charges no longer existed. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat force, wrote in his war diary on September 8, 1943, "The introduction of head-throwing weapons by the enemy has fundamentally altered the tactical balance. Our submarines can no longer rely on the brief period of acoustic blindness that depth charge attacks previously provided. The loss rate has become unsustainable." In October 1943, Dönitz withdrew the U-boat fleet from the North Atlantic entirely, the first time since 1940 that German submarines had completely abandoned the primary convoy routes. When they returned in November with new tactics and improved equipment, they found that the Hedgehog had been supplemented by additional ahead-throwing weapons, better sonar, and escort carriers. The Battle of the Atlantic was effectively over. The Allies would lose ships to U-boats for the rest of the war, but never again would German submarines threaten to sever the supply line between North America and Britain. Howard Sands never returned to sea combat. From May 1943 until August 1945, he worked at the Anti-Submarine Warfare Division headquarters in London, training crews, reviewing attack reports, and refining Hedgehog tactics. He wrote the tactical manual that became standard doctrine. He analyzed every combat firing, calculated success rates, identified failure patterns. He also kept his personal notebook. By war's end, it contained 347 entries, one for each Hedgehog attack he'd been able to document. Next to each entry, he wrote the name of the escort ship, the date, and the result. For the confirmed destructions, he added one more notation: estimated crew saved. The calculation was simple. Every U-boat destroyed was one that couldn't torpedo merchant ships. Every merchant ship that didn't sink was 40 to 60 sailors who didn't freeze in the North Atlantic. By Sands's conservative estimate, and he was very conservative, noting in the margin that his numbers were almost certainly low, the modified Hedgehog system had saved approximately 700 merchant seamen from drowning. He never showed the notebook to anyone. After the war, Sands returned to Portsmouth. He didn't open a garage with Morrison. Morrison was still dead, still 23, still at the bottom of the Atlantic in the wreckage of HMS Bluebell. Instead, Sands took a job at his father's boat repair shop. He married a woman named Catherine who worked at the post office. They had 3 children. He fixed fishing boats, maintained harbor equipment, occasionally helped the Coast Guard with mechanical problems. He never talked about the war. His children knew he'd been in the Navy. They knew he'd served on corvettes. They didn't know about the Hedgehog, about U-564, about the modifications he'd made, or about the 700 sailors who'd probably survived because of those modifications. In 1987, a naval historian named James Robertson was researching anti-submarine weapons development. He found references in Admiralty archives to unauthorized field modifications to Hedgehog spigot mortars, April 1943. The documents mentioned HMS Sunflower and a Lieutenant Commander Sands, but provided few details. Robertson tracked Sands to Portsmouth. He knocked on the door of a small house near the harbour on a Tuesday afternoon in November. A 70-year-old man with weathered hands and a slight limp answered. "Mr. Sands, Howard Sands, formerly of HMS Sunflower." "That was a long time ago. I'm researching the Hedgehog mortar. Your name appears in several documents. I was hoping you might answer some questions." Sands was quiet for a moment. Then, "I suppose you'd better come in." The interview lasted 3 hours. Robertson recorded it on a cassette tape, one of only 2 known recordings of Sands discussing the war. Most of the conversation was technical, rail angles, spread patterns, firing sequences. But near the end, Robertson asked about the decision to fire inside the safe radius. "Weren't you afraid of hitting your own ship?" Sands thought about that for a long time. "I was afraid of a lot of things," he finally said. "Hitting my own ship was pretty far down the list. What was at the top? Missing, and having to write another letter to someone's mother, explaining why her son drowned because we couldn't work out how to sink submarines properly." Robertson asked one final question. "Do you have any regrets about how things turned out? The lack of recognition? The fact that your contribution wasn't officially acknowledged?" Sands looked out his window toward Portsmouth Harbour, where fishing boats and small craft moved slowly through the grey water. "Morrison didn't get any recognition either," he said. "Neither did the other 471 men who died because depth charges didn't work properly. Recognition isn't really the point, is it? The point was stopping the dying." Howard Sands passed away on March 14, 1992, at the age of 73. His obituary in the Portsmouth Herald mentioned his naval service in a single sentence. He served in the Royal Navy during World War II. There was no mention of the Hedgehog, of U-564, of the modified launcher, or of the estimated 700 lives saved. His funeral was attended by 47 people, mostly family and neighbours. None of them knew that one of the men who came, elderly, walking with a cane, standing at the back, was Peter Worth, the engineer from Sheffield, who'd asked about the premature detonation risk back in 1943. Worth didn't speak to anyone. He stood for the entire service, then placed a small object on Sands's casket before leaving. It was a brass plaque about 4 inches square with an inscription, "HMS Sunflower, April 17, 1943. First Hedgehog destruction, first of many." The plaque is now in the collection of the Royal Navy Submarine Museum in Gosport, in a small display about anti-submarine warfare development. The display includes a photograph of a Hedgehog launcher, a cutaway diagram showing the projectile design, and a brief text panel explaining the weapon's effectiveness. Howard Sands is not mentioned, but if you look carefully at the photograph of the Hedgehog launcher, you can see that the rails are angled slightly lower than the technical specifications would indicate. And if you examine the spread pattern diagram, you'll notice the circle is tighter than the factory standard. Those modifications, made in the dark of a forward equipment locker at 11:40 p.m. on April 3, 1943, by a 24-year-old lieutenant with a damaged left hand, are still there frozen in the historical record. Not in words, not in official recognition, in angles, in numbers, in the precise mathematics of keeping men alive. If this story moved you, we need you to do something. Hit that like button, not for us, but because stories like Howard Sands deserve to be heard. Subscribe to this channel so these forgotten heroes aren't forgotten forever. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Did someone in your family serve in the war? Do you have a connection to the Atlantic convoys, to submarines, to the merchant marine? We want to hear from you. These stories matter because people like you decide they matter. Thank you for keeping Howard Sands' memory alive. Thank you for keeping Jeremy Morrison's memory alive. Thank you for remembering the 700 sailors who survived, because one man decided that following orders was less important than stopping the dying. History isn't just what's written in the official records. Sometimes it's written in the angle of a modified launcher rail, in the 3-degree adjustment that no one authorized, in the calculated risk that could have ended in court-martial, but instead saved thousands of lives. That's the history worth remembering, and that's why we keep telling these stories.